6.3. In this lecture, Mr. Manelsky and myself are going to be covering the Jefferson presidency, the third president of the United States of America. The objectives today are to identify some of the significant changes brought about during the early years of Jefferson's presidency, provide examples of the Federalist decline in power, and summarize the importance of the Louisiana Purchase and the Lewis and Clark expeditions.
All right, so the first election of 1800, right, is John Adams, the sitting president, who's, again, Washington's vice president, runs after Washington resigns, is elected in 1896. Jefferson was his vice president, because again, the loser was the vice president during these times. They hadn't changed that law yet. And Jefferson beats John Adams in the presidential election of 1800. Right? Jefferson and Democratic Republicans are able to take the White House, or was it the White House?
Yes, it was actually, this was the first president to live in the White House in Washington, D.C.
So take the White House in Washington, D.C. back from the Federalists. It's very significant because we have a peaceful transition of power, which we weren't sure if that was going to happen. We actually see this is actually really important, that when someone loses an election and just quits, and he leaves. Very important for a stable democracy.
And that's the one thing you really want to keep in mind with the election of 1800. And to sort of lay the groundwork a little bit for you so you can more easily make that connection. Remember, we have Washington, who ran for 2 terms, is identified as a Federalist, but wasn't technically a Federalist. We had Sam Adams in the election in 1796. The Federalists were in power, although the Democratic Republicans were definitely threatening their power. And then in 1800, the 2 Democratic Republicans win the presidency and the vice presidency.
Another thing to remember this, if you don't think the 3/5 clause matters, Jefferson wins by 12 electoral votes, which is the number of seats the South had because of their slave population.
Because of the 3/5 compromise.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So the 3/5 compromise actually propels Jefferson into the presidency because of the strength of the Democratic Republicans in the South.
And we'll see that later in future election, African Americans having huge weight in their vote following the Civil War. So the Revolution of 1800, as it's keyed, has happened. The Democratic Republicans have now taken over in the presidency and the legislative branch, so the House of Representatives and the Senate. And that becomes extremely important because under Jefferson's administration, there are going to be a lot of changes. And it's important to know that the Democratic Republicans now have control. Jefferson was a man of moderate esteem. He did not like to push his chest out. He did not like to tell people he was more intelligent or more important than them. He truly viewed himself as a man of the people. And because of that, he believed in small local government. He did not think that the federal government should have a lot of power. He believed in giving the power back to small businesses and small landowners. He was truly an agrarian man. He owned a huge plantation, and he thought that farmers were really the heartbeat of the United States of America. And because of that, he opened the U.S. up, not just farmers, but merchants too, to ideas of free trade.
Okay. The Judiciary Act of 1801 is actually passed and signed into law by Adams, right? I mean, it said earlier the Democratic Republicans had control over the legislative branch and the executive branch. The judicial branch is basically, because of this Judiciary Act of 1801, Adams is able to basically pack most of the federal court system with Federalist judges. And most importantly, John Marshall is able to command the Supreme Court in a Federalist way. So John Marshall's Supreme Court is going to be able to hand down many Federalist-leaning decisions that are going to help expand the power of the federal government, expand the power of the national government, and keep Federalist ideas alive in the national consciousness until 1824 when Marshall resigned.
And one thing that's important to keep in mind is although Adams loses the election in November, he's not actually kicked out of office until March, which is a really depressing reality, right? He's fired and then told he has 4 more months until he has to clean out his desk. So what Mr. Manelsky mentioned of assigning all of these Federalist-leaning judges, this is his last-ditch effort to make sure the only branch of government left which can still be Federalist John Adams wanted to pack it with Federalists. And it's important to keep in mind, right, this term is for life. If you are a judge, you can be a judge for life unless you do something horribly wrong. And that brings us to the biggest controversy in Thomas Jefferson's presidency. Because John Adams packed the judicial branch with all of these federal judges, they're nicknamed the Midnight Judges because it is said that Mr. Adams was up until midnight signing the commissions for all of these judges. Well, the problem was, is not all of those commissions were actually hand-delivered to the judges. So there was one judge named William Marbury who never received his actual paperwork but was told he was assigned to a judgeship. He complained to the Secretary of State, James Madison, who's Thomas Jefferson's buddy and Secretary of State, that he deserved to be a judge, he was appointed the judge, and that his paperwork, his commission, should absolutely be sent to him. Now, here's the issue, right? So, John Marshall is now the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And it gets a bit complicated, and make sure you do the activity on Marbury v. Madison to understand exactly what happened. But what ended up being extremely important is John Marshall made a ruling that established the idea of judicial review.
So judicial review is basically kind of the idea that we think of as the Supreme Court's power, the ability to take a law and strike it down as unconstitutional. That is what judicial review is. Before Marbury v. Madison, the Supreme Court would kind of decide on cases, but it's not necessarily said in the Constitution that it can declare a law unconstitutional. Marshall just decided that because of Marbury v. Madison, he's going to take that power for the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court's going to be able to then decide on whether laws are constitutional or not and strike down laws that are deemed unconstitutional by the court. And this is going to be seen over and over again in American history where a Supreme Court is able to change the laws of the country by interpreting the Constitution one way or the other.
And like I said, make sure you really do the activity on Marbury v. Madison. It will help explain all the nitty-gritty details about this case. But you just need to know judicial review was established. And that gives the judicial branch so much more power than it ever had. James Madison specifically designed the judicial branch, seeing as they're not elected by the people and they have a life term, he specifically designed it to be the weakest branch. But now it's almost on equal footing.
Okay. Last major part of the Jefferson administration is the Louisiana Purchase, right? And so Louisiana, which was given to Spain, kind of made its way back into French possession, and Napoleon wants to recreate the new France, the French Empire, in the New World, and Louisiana is a big part of that. The only problem is he needs to solidify Haiti first, which had just fallen to a slave revolt and had created a new independent government. The French army invades Haiti. They all die from yellow fever. They fail. They lose. The Haitians win, and Napoleon no longer has any need for Louisiana.
So what the United States of America did, knowing that the French are sort of giving up on their ideas of a French empire, we sent James Monroe over to offer $10 million just to ship things out of New Orleans. And Napoleon, desperate for money in his war with Britain, said, I'll give you an even better offer. $15 million for the entire thing. And without hesitating, the United States of America, its representative James Monroe in Paris, bought the entire land of Louisiana. We sent Lewis and Clark, along with a native guide they met, Sacagawea, to explore this land to see if there is a water route all the way to the Pacific, which there is. And they brought back all types of findings from Louisiana, which really made people excited to move west. Now, the big question here is this constitutional? Thomas Jefferson realized he's a strict constructionist, right? If it doesn't say it in the Constitution, you can't do it. Well, nowhere in the Constitution does it give the president the power to purchase land without asking anyone. So this was a very difficult decision for Thomas Jefferson to make. He thought it was too good to turn down, so he had to do it. But he even acknowledged he might be exceeding his constitutional authority.
But in the end, Kind of worked out.
It worked out.
He did what he wanted.
Double the size of America for 3 cents an acre was one of the best decisions in American history, but once again, sort of made him look like a hypocrite. Thanks for watching 6.3, guys. If you have any questions, be sure to ask your history